During the funeral service, my daughter-in-law whispered, "She should be in the casket, not the front pew." I prayed in silence. The next morning, she received a copy of my will. That whisper, those 9 cruel words, shouldn't have surprised me after 15 years of Sarah's subtle cruelty. Yet they cut deeper than I expected, especially while watching my beloved Harold's casket being lowered into the ground. 52 years of marriage, gone. And according to my daughter-in-law, I should have joined him. I kept my composure, my eyes fixed on the polished mahogany casket adorned with white lilies. Harold would have wanted dignity. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching, not drama. So I straightened my back, clutched my handkerchief tighter, and pretended I hadn't heard her. My son Thomas stood between us, oblivious to his wife's whispered venom. He hadn't truly seen me in years, not since Sarah entered our lives. The vibrant, loving boy who once brought me wildflowers every Sunday had slowly transformed into a distant stranger who checked his watch during our increasingly rare visits. "Mom," Thomas touched my elbow as people began dispersing after the service. "Sarah thinks it would be best if you stayed with us tonight. Not I think or we want you to. Sarah thinks." Even in his invitation, I was an afterthought, a problem to be managed. "Thank you, but I'll be fine at home," I replied, watching Sarah's perfectly made-up face tighten with annoyance. She'd probably planned to spend the evening going through my belongings, assessing what she'd claim once I was gone too. "Don't be stubborn, Ellen." Sarah's voice carried that familiar patronizing tone she reserved just for me. "You shouldn't be alone right now." What she meant was, I shouldn't be unsupervised. "Diane is staying with me," I said, nodding toward my oldest friend, who stood waiting by her car. "But thank you for your concern." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. Another decision made without her approval. Another small battle in our silent war. The drive home with Diane was quiet, the weight of the day settling around us like a heavy blanket. Harold's absence was palpable in every corner of the house we'd shared for nearly 5 decades. The armchair where he read his newspaper every evening, the coffee mug still sitting on the kitchen counter from his last breakfast. "You know, she's just waiting for you to fall apart," Diane said as she prepared tea in my kitchen. "We'd been friends since college. She knew me better than anyone still living. Or waiting for you to die." I sighed, sinking into a kitchen chair. "She made that quite clear today." Diane placed a steaming cup in front of me. "What did she say this time?" "That I should be in the casket instead of Harold." Diane's hand froze. Midair. "She didn't. She did." Right there in the funeral home while everyone was paying their respects. "And Thomas, did he hear?" I shook my head. Would it matter if he had? He's been under her spell for years. The sad truth was that my only child had become a stranger to me. Sarah had orchestrated it so carefully that he never noticed what was happening. First, it was small things. Our Sunday dinners reduced to monthly visits because they were so busy. Then came the canceled plans, the forgotten birthdays, the holidays spent with Sarah's family instead. By the time Harold got sick, Thomas was calling less than once a month. Sarah had constructed a wall between us brick by brick, and now it stood complete. "I don't understand how he doesn't see it," Diane said, her voice heavy with frustration. "Love is blind, I suppose." I took a sip of tea, finding little comfort in its warmth. "Or maybe it's easier to believe your mother is needy and difficult than to admit your wife is manipulative and cruel." The house creaked and settled around us, as if adjusting to its new reality without Harold. I'd never spent a night here without him. Even when he traveled for work, I'd always known he was coming back. Now the emptiness stretched endlessly before me. "What will you do now?" Diane asked, her eyes filled with concern. I thought about Sarah's whispered wish for my death, about all the years of subtle cruelty, the way she'd systematically alienated my son from me. I thought about how she'd begun dropping hints about senior living communities months before Harold even got sick. "I think," I said slowly, "it's time I had a talk with my lawyer." The next morning, after Diane left, I called James Hoffman, who had been handling our legal affairs since Harold and I purchased our first home. His secretary put me through immediately. "Ellen, I'm so sorry about Harold," James said, his voice warm with genuine sympathy. "How are you holding up?" "As well as can be expected," I replied. "But I need to make some changes to my will, as soon as possible." There was a brief pause. "I understand. When would you like to come in?" "Today, if you can fit me in," Another pause, longer this time. This sounds urgent, Ellen. It is. I glanced at the photograph of Thomas on my mantel, his college graduation, before Sarah, when his smile still reached his eyes when he looked at me. Very urgent. I can see you at 2:00. Thank you, James. And one more thing. This stays between us. Thomas can't know. Of course, Ellen. Complete confidentiality. I hung up the phone and looked around the living room at the life Harold and I had built together. The antique clock he'd given me on our 25th anniversary, the quilt my mother had made for our wedding, the wall of family photos chronicling years of birthdays, graduations, and holidays. Sarah had already begun eyeing these treasures during her visits, making casual comments about how certain pieces would look perfect in their home, as if my memories were just decorative items waiting to be claimed. Not anymore. If Sarah thought I would fade quietly away, convenient and compliant, she was sorely mistaken. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Behind my polite smiles and quiet demeanor was a woman who had survived the Great Depression as a child, who had worked 2 jobs to put herself through college, who had stood by Harold through 3 career changes and built a life from nothing. May have been grieving, but I wasn't broken, and I certainly wasn't going to let Sarah win. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Harold and I had planned for this. My sweet, practical Harold, who knew Sarah's nature better than Thomas ever would. "Promise me," he had whispered during one of his last lucid moments in the hospital. "Promise me you'll protect yourself when I'm gone." I had promised, and Ellen Chambers always kept her promises. I picked up the phone again and dialed Thomas's number. Sarah answered on the 3rd ring. "Sarah, dear," I said, my voice steady. "I was wondering if you and Thomas might come for dinner tomorrow night. There's something important I'd like to discuss with both of you." James Hoffman's office hadn't changed in 20 years. The same oak desk, leather-bound law books, and the faint smell of pipe tobacco that lingered despite his having quit a decade ago. It was comforting in its constancy, especially now when everything else in my life had shifted so dramatically. "These are significant changes, Ellen," James said, reviewing the notes he'd taken during our 2-hour meeting. "Are you absolutely certain this is what you want to do?" I nodded, my hand steady in my lap. "Absolutely certain." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the careful gaze of someone who'd known me for over 40 years. "This will cause quite a stir when it comes to light." "I'm counting on it," I replied. James smiled slightly, a glimmer of the young, ambitious lawyer who'd once helped Harold and me navigate the purchase of our first home. "Harold always said you had a backbone of steel beneath those cardigans." The mention of my late husband brought a sharp pang of grief, but I pushed through it. Harold knew exactly who Sarah was. He just didn't want to hurt Thomas by saying so. "And you think this will open Thomas's eyes?" I sighed, the weight of years of watching my son drift away settling heavily on my shoulders. "I don't know if anything will at this point, but I have to try." On the drive home, I thought about how it had all begun. Sarah had seemed so perfect. When Thomas first brought her home, polite, attentive, asking questions about our family photos, and telling Thomas how lucky he was to have such loving parents. Harold had been charmed, but I'd caught something in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. A calculating gaze as she surveyed our home, assessing its worth. I'd dismissed it then as nerves or my own overprotectiveness. How I wish I'd trusted my instincts. After the wedding, Sarah's true nature emerged slowly, like a poisonous plant that takes years to bloom. She'd call to cancel visits at the last minute because Thomas was working so hard and needed rest. She'd interrupt my conversations with my son, answering questions directed at him. She'd misremember to pass along messages, leaving me waiting by the phone for calls that never came. When I tried to speak to Thomas about it, he accused me of being jealous, of not wanting him to have a life of his own. "Mom, Sarah's just trying to help us have a healthy marriage with appropriate boundaries," he'd said, using words that sounded rehearsed, as if he were quoting from a script she'd prepared. By the time Harold was diagnosed with cancer, Sarah had successfully reduced our relationship to obligatory monthly visits and awkward holiday gatherings where I felt like an unwelcome guest in my son's life. The dinner table that night was laden with Harold's favorite dishes: pot roast, scalloped potatoes, and apple pie, a small tribute to the man who should have been sitting at the head of the table. Instead, Thomas took that seat without hesitation, while Sarah sat where I used to, leaving me at the side like an afterthought. "This is lovely, Mom," Thomas said, helping himself to the potatoes. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It wasn't trouble," I replied. watching as Sarah inspected her food with barely concealed suspicion, as if I might have poisoned it. These were your father's favorites. I wanted to honor him. Sarah gave a tight smile. So thoughtful, though perhaps a bit excessive so soon after the funeral. You should be resting, not cooking elaborate meals. There it was again. The subtle undermining, the implication that I was doing something wrong, something inappropriate, that I couldn't be trusted to know my own needs or limitations. Cooking helps me, I said simply. It gives me purpose. Thomas cleared his throat, clearly, uncomfortable with even this mild disagreement. The food is great, Mom. Really. We ate in silence for a few minutes, the clink of silverware against plates the only sound in the room that had once been filled with laughter and conversation when Harold was alive. So, Sarah finally said, dabbing at her lips with a napkin. You mentioned there was something important to discuss. I set down my fork, my appetite gone. Yes, I wanted to let you know that I've updated my will. Thomas looked up, surprise evident on his face. Already? Mom, it's only been a few days since Dad… I know, dear, but it needed to be done. I folded my hands on the table, steadying myself for what came next. In light of recent revelations, Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. Revelations? Your comment at the funeral was quite revealing, Sarah. Thomas looked between us, confusion creasing his brow. What comment? I held Sarah's gaze. Your wife suggested that I should be in the casket instead of your father. The color drained from Thomas's face. What? Mom, that's absolutely ridiculous. Sarah cut in, her voice sharp with indignation. I never said any such thing. Ellen, grief can play terrible tricks on the mind. Perhaps you misheard. I heard you perfectly, I said, my voice calm but firm. As did Diane, who was sitting next to me. Sarah's face hardened, the mask of concerned daughter-in-law slipping for just a moment. Well, Diane has never liked me. I'm sure she'd say anything to cause problems between us. Thomas placed his hand over Sarah's, his expression troubled. Sarah wouldn't say something like that, Mom. Maybe you did misunderstand. And there it was, the automatic defense, the immediate assumption that I was wrong, confused, or lying. Never Sarah. Never his wife. Perhaps, I conceded, not wanting to push too hard too quickly. Regardless, I've made some changes to my arrangements that you both should be aware of. I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table to Sarah. This is a copy of the relevant sections. I thought you'd want to see it right away since you've expressed such concern about my estate planning in the past. Sarah's fingers twitched slightly as she took the envelope, her eyes never leaving my face. That's considerate of you, Ellen, but there's no rush. We don't need to discuss such morbid matters so soon after Harold's passing. But I could see the curiosity burning in her eyes, the barely contained eagerness to know what she stood to gain. Please, I insisted. Open it now. I'd like to answer any questions you might have. Sarah's manicured fingers trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. The dining room fell silent except for the soft ticking of Harold's grandfather clock, a sound that had kept time through 52 years of our marriage. I watched her face, carefully as her eyes scanned the document. First confusion, then disbelief, followed by a flash of raw anger that she quickly masked with a practiced smile. Mom, Thomas said, his voice tinged with worry. What is this about? Sarah handed him the papers, her composure remarkable despite the flush creeping up her neck. Your mother has decided to establish a trust, she explained, her tone artificially light, rather than leaving her estate directly to you. Thomas frowned as he read the document, confusion evident in his furrowed brow. A charitable foundation? Mom, I don't understand. I took a sip of water, giving myself a moment to choose my words carefully. The Harold Chambers Foundation will support causes your father cared about. Literacy programs, veterans services, the community center downtown. But, Thomas glanced back at the document. It says most of your estate will go to the foundation. What about… He stopped himself, but I knew what he meant to say. What about us? What about the inheritance Sarah had been counting on? You're mentioned as well, Thomas, I said gently. You'll receive a monthly stipend from the trust. Sarah's knuckles whitened as she gripped her fork. A stipend? Like an allowance? Thomas is your only child, Ellen. Yes, he is, I agreed. And I've made provisions for him. But your father and I always believed in giving back to the community. This foundation will be his legacy. Thomas set the papers down, looking lost. Did Dad know about this? This was his wish, I said simply. It wasn't entirely a lie. Harold had always been generous with charitable donations. The specific structure of the foundation had been my idea, but its spirit was true to his values. Sarah's smile was tight enough to crack. How thoughtful. Though it seems a bit elaborate. Wouldn't a simple bequest to charity accomplish the same thing? Without all these, she gestured at the document, restrictions and conditions. So she'd noticed that part. Good. The foundation ensures the money will be managed properly, I explained. And the conditions are there to protect everyone's interests. Thomas was still scanning the document, his expression growing more troubled. Mom, it says here that if I get divorced, the monthly stipend converts to a lump sum payment of the entire trust? Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes widening before she could control her reaction. I folded my napkin carefully, buying time. It's just a standard clause, dear. James suggested it for tax purposes. Another small lie, but necessary. There are several scenarios outlined that would trigger different distributions. It feels like you don't trust me, Thomas said, hurt. Evident in his voice. It's not about trust, I assured him. It's about protecting what your father and I built together. Protecting it from Sarah, I didn't add. From the woman who had been mentally cataloging my possessions for years, who had gradually isolated my son from me, who had wished me dead, at my husband's funeral. Sarah placed her hand over Thomas's, her diamond ring catching the light. Your mother is just being cautious, she said soothingly. Though I have to say, Ellen, these conditions seem rather pointed. Our eyes met across the table, and for a brief moment the pretense dropped away. She knew exactly what I was doing. And she was furious. It's been a difficult few days, I said, rising from my chair. Perhaps we should table this discussion for now. Would anyone like coffee with dessert? As I busied myself in the kitchen, cutting slices of apple pie, I could hear them whispering in the dining room. Sarah's voice was low and urgent, while Thomas's responses were hesitant, defensive. Good. Let her show her true colors. Let her reveal herself in her anger. When I returned with the pie, an uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Sarah declined, her slice suddenly remembering a diet she was on. Thomas ate mechanically, avoiding my eyes. There's one more thing, I said as I sat down with my own slice. I've decided to volunteer at the community center downtown. They need help with their adult literacy program. Thomas looked up, surprise evident on his face. You're going to volunteer? So soon after Dad. I need to keep busy, I explained, and it's something I've always wanted to do. Sarah's smile didn't reach her eyes. Are you sure that's wise, Ellen? At your age, taking on new commitments. I'm 68, Sarah, not 98, I replied evenly, and the doctor says I'm in excellent health. Still, she persisted, grief can be so draining. I worry about you overdoing it. I'd heard this concern many times before. Sarah's worries about my health, my age, my abilities, all designed to make me feel diminished, incapable, to justify sidelining me from family decisions, from my own son's life. That's very thoughtful, I said, but I'm quite capable of managing my own schedule. Thomas cleared his throat. The pie is delicious, Mom. A peace offering, a change of subject. My son, always the peacemaker, always avoiding confrontation. Even now, he couldn't see the manipulative web Sarah had woven around him, around us all. After dessert, Sarah made a show of checking her watch. We should get going, Thomas. Early morning tomorrow. Thomas nodded, already standing. Thanks for dinner, Mom, and for, sharing your plans with us. I walked them to the door, accepting Thomas's awkward hug and Sarah's air kiss near my cheek. As they stepped onto the porch, Sarah turned back. Ellen, she said, her voice honeyed with false concern. Please do call if you need anything. Anything at all. We're worried about you, all alone in this big house. Behind her, Thomas was already walking to the car, keys in hand, oblivious to the Cold War being waged between his mother and his wife. I appreciate your concern, I replied, matching her saccharine tone. But I'm never really alone. Harold's presence is everywhere in this house. I smiled, letting my expression harden just slightly. And I have excellent neighbors who check on me regularly. People who've known me for decades. Sarah's smile faltered for just a moment. Well, good night then. I watched them drive away. Sarah already talking animatedly to Thomas, no doubt spinning my decisions, planting seeds of doubt and resentment. But it didn't matter. The first move had been made, the pieces set in motion. Back inside, I washed the dishes methodically, finding comfort in the familiar routine. The house felt emptier than ever without Harold, but for the first time since his death, I felt a sense of purpose stirring within me. Sarah thought she had won. She thought I was a feeble old woman she could easily manipulate and discard, but she had underestimated me badly. I dried my hands and picked up the phone to call Diane. "How did it go?" she asked without preamble. "Exactly as expected," I replied. "Sarah's furious about the foundation. Thomas is confused." "And the divorce clause? Did she notice it?" "Oh yes," I said, allowing myself a small smile. "She noticed." The community center bustled with activity as I arranged reading materials. 3 weeks had passed since I'd shown Sarah and Thomas my updated will, and our silent war had escalated into something more overt. "Ellen, you're a godsend," Margaret, the program coordinator, said. "Our Tuesday attendance has doubled since you started." I smiled, pleased at the small victory. I just connect with them because I understand what it's like to feel invisible. These sessions had become my lifeline. Here I wasn't just a grieving widow or a disappointing mother. I was needed, respected, heard. My phone buzzed, a text from Thomas. "Mom, can we talk? Alone. Lunch tomorrow?" My heart leapt with hope. Thomas hadn't sought out time alone with me in years. Sarah had made sure of that. "Of course. Noon at Magnolia Cafe?" I replied. His response came quickly. "Perfect. See you then." The session flew by, and before I knew it, I was driving home, my thoughts churning. What if Thomas had finally recognized Sarah's true nature? I pulled into my driveway and froze. Sarah's sleek BMW was parked in front of my house. She sat on my porch swing, arms crossed, designer sunglasses concealing her eyes despite the overcast day. Her posture reminded me of a cat waiting outside a mouse hole. "Sarah," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "This is a surprise." She removed her sunglasses with theatrical slowness. "Is it? I thought we should talk. Mother too." "Mother-in-law." I unlocked the front door. "Would you like to come in?" She followed me inside, her gaze sweeping critically over the living room. "You've changed things." Indeed I had. The formal living room now housed my sewing machine and a reading chair. Harold's study had been transformed into an art space where I'd begun painting again after 40 years. "Yes," I replied simply. "Tea?" "No." She remained standing, clutching her designer handbag. "I'll be brief. I want to know what game you're playing." I settled into my chair. "I'm not playing any game, Sarah. The will, the foundation, that ridiculous divorce clause." Her composure slipped, revealing anger beneath. "Did you really think I wouldn't realize what you're doing?" "And what exactly am I doing?" I asked mildly. "Trying to turn Thomas against me." The words burst from her. "Volunteering, changing your will, rearranging the house. It's also transparent. You're trying to manipulate him into thinking you're this poor, mistreated victim. Is that what you think?" "I know exactly what you're doing," she continued, pacing now. "You couldn't stand that Thomas chose me, that he built a life separate from you. Why else would you put that divorce clause in your will?" she demanded. "You're trying to bribe my husband to leave me." "The clause protects the assets Harold and I worked our entire lives to build," I said calmly. She laughed, a brittle sound, without humor. "Please, we both know what this is about." "Sarah," I said, my patience wearing thin, "you wished me dead at my husband's funeral. You've systematically isolated Thomas from me for years. You've made it clear that you're waiting for me to die so you can get your hands on my home and my money." She blinked, momentarily taken aback by my directness. "So yes, I've taken steps to protect myself and what Harold and I built together." "You spiteful old woman," Sarah hissed, her facade crumbling completely. "Thomas already suspects something is wrong. He's asking questions about finances, about decisions we've made together. So that explained the lunch invitation." "He should ask questions," I replied. "He should know exactly what's happening with his life." Sarah's face contorted with fury. "I've worked too hard to let you ruin everything now. Thomas will never believe you over me. Never." "Perhaps not," I conceded. But it seems he's already beginning to doubt. She stepped closer, looming over me. Listen carefully. If you say one word to Thomas, if you try to poison him against me, I will make sure you never see him or your grandchildren again. We don't have grandchildren, Sarah. A strange smile crossed her face. Not yet. But when we do, just imagine how sad it will be for them to grow up never knowing their grandmother. Children are so impressionable, aren't they? So easy to convince that someone is unstable, dangerous even. Are you threatening me in my own home? I asked, my voice quiet but firm. I'm explaining reality, she replied. Thomas chose me. He will always choose me. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting but my spine straight. I think you should leave now. She smirked, clearly believing she'd won. Gladly. But remember what I said. After she left, I sank back into my chair, trembling slightly. In all our years of silent warfare, Sarah had never been so openly hostile. She was scared. And a scared Sarah was dangerous. I called Diane immediately. Sarah just left, I said. She threatened to keep me from seeing any future grandchildren if I poisoned Thomas against her. That woman is a piece of work. What are you going to do about lunch with Thomas tomorrow? I gazed at Harold's photograph on the mantel. I'm going to tell him the truth. All of it. Are you sure? Sarah will be furious. She already is, I replied, and I'm done playing her games. After hanging up, I went to my art room, formerly Harold's study, and pulled out the leather journal I'd been keeping for years. Inside were dated entries documenting every slight, every manipulative comment, every canceled plan. Years of Sarah's campaign to isolate Thomas from me, recorded in my neat handwriting. I'd started it on Harold's advice. Document everything, he'd said after a particularly painful holiday where Sarah had forgotten to tell us the celebration had been moved, leaving us waiting alone for hours. Someday, Thomas might need to see the pattern. I hoped that someday had finally arrived. The Magnolia Cafe hadn't changed in 20 years. Same blue checkered tablecloths, same homemade pies displayed in a glass case by the register. Thomas, and I used to come here every Saturday when he was in high school, before college took him away, before Sarah came into our lives. I arrived 15 minutes early, the leather journal tucked in my purse. My hands weren't steady, but my resolve was when Thomas walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. His shoulders were hunched, his face drawn with worry. He'd lost weight. How had I not noticed at Harold's funeral or at our dinner? Mom, he said, leaning down to kiss my cheek, a gesture that had become rare over the years. You look tired, I said, as he settled into the chair across from me. He ran a hand through his hair, now flecked with gray at the temples. I haven't been sleeping well. Our waitress appeared with menus, but Thomas waved her off. Just coffee for me, thanks. I ordered a cup of tea, concerned by his lack of appetite. When we were alone again, Thomas stared down at the table, seemingly unable to meet my eyes. What's going on? I asked gently. You're worrying me. He took a deep breath. Dad's life insurance policy. I can't find any record of it. Of all the things I'd expected him to say, this wasn't one of them. What do you mean? Sarah said you and Dad had a substantial policy, but when I called the insurance company, they had no record of it. I frowned, confused. Your father and I never had a life insurance policy, Thomas. We didn't need one. Our house was paid off years ago, and we had our retirement savings. Thomas's head snapped up, his eyes wide. But Sarah said, he trailed off, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker. She told me you both had a policy worth $500,000. The pieces clicked into place. Is that why you've been asking about finances? Looking for a policy that doesn't exist? He nodded slowly. Sarah said we needed it for investments she's been making. What investments, Thomas? His laugh was hollow. That's the thing. I don't know. For years, she's handled all our finances. Said it was better that way because of her business background. He paused, his coffee untouched. Last week, I discovered our joint account has been emptied. When I asked her about it, she said she'd moved the money into those investments. My heart ached for my son, so clearly in distress, but I felt a glimmer of hope. He was finally seeing what I'd known for years. Thomas, I said carefully, there's something I need to show you. I pulled out the journal and placed it on the table between us. I've been keeping this for a long time. He stared at it warily. What is it? A record of everything that's happened since you married Sarah. His jaw tightened. Mom, if this is just you complaining about, it's not complaints. It's facts. Dates, times, exactly what was said and done. I pushed the journal toward him. Your father suggested I keep it. Thomas looked surprised. Dad? He never said anything about, he didn't want to come between you and Sarah. Neither did I. I took a deep breath, but I think it's time you knew the truth. For a long moment, Thomas didn't move. Then, slowly, he reached for the journal and opened it. I watched his face as he read the first few entries. Sarah forgetting to invite me to his birthday dinner. Sarah telling relatives I was too frail to attend family gatherings. Sarah intercepting my phone calls and not passing along messages. There's more, I said softly. Much more. He flipped through the pages, his expression growing increasingly troubled. This can't be. Sarah wouldn't. Keep reading, I urged. His hands trembled slightly as he turned to a more recent entry, one from just after Harold's diagnosis. November 12th, heard Sarah on the phone discussing the old man's money and how she just needs to be patient. When I entered the room, she quickly ended the call. Thomas looked up, his face pale. Mom, this is the truth. I finished for him, all of it. He closed the journal, his expression unreadable. She told me you were imagining things. That grief was making you paranoid, and you believed her. He nodded, shame evident in his eyes. It was easier than believing my wife could be so calculating. She's isolated you from me for years, Thomas. And now she's looking for money that doesn't exist. He seemed to age before my eyes, the weight of realization settling on his shoulders. All those canceled plans, all those times you supposedly didn't want to see us. That was her? I nodded. Every time. Thomas buried his face in his hands. God, I've been such a fool. You loved her, I said gently. You trusted her. There's no shame in that. There is when I chose her over my own mother. His voice broke. When I let her treat you like this for years. A heavy silence fell between us, broken only by the ambient sounds of the cafe. What will you do now? I finally asked. Thomas straightened, a new resolve hardening his features. I need to find out exactly what she's been doing with our money. And then, he trailed off, the magnitude of the situation seemingly overwhelming him. And then you'll need to make some difficult decisions. I finished for him. He nodded, his eyes meeting mine with a clarity I hadn't seen in years. Mom, I'm so sorry for everything. I know, I said simply. As we left the cafe, Thomas hugged me tightly, like he used to before Sarah came into our lives. I'll call you tonight, he promised. After I talked to Sarah, I watched him drive away, my heart both heavy and hopeful. The truth was finally out, but I knew the worst was yet to come. Sarah wouldn't surrender without a fight. When I returned home, Diane was waiting on my porch, concern etched on her face. How did it go? I sat beside her on the swing Harold had built when we first moved in. He knows now. All of it. And Sarah's been spending their money on mysterious investments. She told Thomas we had a life insurance policy worth $500,000. Diane's eyes widened. But you never... Exactly. And now Thomas is going to confront her. Oh, Ellen. Diane squeezed my hand. That's going to be a disaster. I nodded, picturing Sarah's rage when cornered. I know, but it needed to happen. As evening fell, I paced my living room, waiting for Thomas's call. When my phone finally rang at 9:47 p.m., it wasn't Thomas's name on the screen, but the hospital's. Mrs. Chambers? A formal voice asked. This is Memorial Hospital. Your son Thomas has been in an accident. The hospital corridor seemed endless as I rushed toward the emergency room, my heart hammering against my ribs. Diane drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, neither of us speaking our fears aloud. Thomas Chambers? I asked the nurse at the reception desk, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm his mother. She directed us to a waiting area where a police officer stood talking to a doctor. When they noticed me, their conversation stopped abruptly. Mrs. Chambers? The officer approached, his expression grave. I'm Officer Miller. Your son was involved in a single car accident. Is he... I couldn't finish the question. He's in surgery, the doctor interjected. The car went off the road into a tree. He has a concussion, broken ribs, and internal bleeding we're addressing. Now? What happened? Diane asked, her arm supporting me as my knees threatened to buckle. Officer Miller consulted his notes. Witnesses say the vehicle was traveling at high speed when it suddenly swerved off the road. We're investigating whether another vehicle was involved. I sank into a chair, images of Thomas as a child flashing through my mind, his first bicycle ride, his high school graduation, the day he left for college, my only child, my boy. Has his wife been notified? The officer asked. I don't know, I replied honestly. As if summoned by the question, Sarah burst through the emergency room doors, her hair disheveled, mascara smeared beneath her eyes. When she saw me, she froze, her expression shifting from concern to something harder, colder. What did you do? She hissed, advancing toward me. What did you say to him? The officer stepped between us. Ma'am, please calm down. Sarah ignored him, her finger pointing accusingly at me. This is your fault. He was fine until he met with you. Sarah, I said quietly, Thomas discovered you've been lying about money. About a lot of things. Her face contorted with fury. You turned him against me. You and your pathetic little diary. The officer placed a restraining hand on Sarah's arm. Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice. She jerked away from him. Do you know what she did? She changed her will to bribe my husband into divorcing me. She's been trying to destroy our marriage for years. Diane stood up, her usually gentle demeanor hardening. That's enough, Sarah. Ellen didn't cause this accident. And she certainly didn't empty your bank accounts. Sarah's eyes widened, her gaze darting between us. He told you about that? Yes, I said simply. He told me everything. The fight seemed to drain out of her suddenly, leaving her looking smaller, almost fragile. You don't understand, she muttered. The investments were real. I just needed time. Before anyone could respond, the doctor returned, his surgical mask pulled down around his neck. Mrs. Chambers? Both Sarah and I turned. Your son is out of surgery. He's stable, but not out of danger yet. Can I see him? We both asked simultaneously. The doctor hesitated. He's asking for his mother. Sarah's face flushed with indignation. But for once, she remained silent as I followed the doctor to the recovery room. Thomas lay pale against the white sheets, tubes, and monitors surrounding him. His face was bruised, a bandage covering part of his head. I approached cautiously, taking his hand in mine. Mom, he whispered, his voice rough. You came. Of course I came. I blinked back tears. What happened, Thomas? He closed his eyes, briefly. Sarah. When I confronted her, she admitted everything. The money's gone, Mom. All of it. She's been gambling online for years. I squeezed his hand gently. That doesn't matter now. You just focus on getting better. I filed for divorce, he said, each word clearly an effort. This afternoon, before the accident. A cold realization washed over me. Thomas, the accident. Did Sarah? He shook his head slightly, wincing at the movement. No, I was driving too fast, not paying attention. I was so angry, so hurt. I brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, careful to avoid his injuries. Rest now. We'll talk more when you're stronger. He caught my hand as I started to pull away. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. I know, I whispered. I know. When I returned to the waiting room, Sarah was gone, but Officer Miller remained, speaking quietly with Diane. Where's Sarah? I asked. Diane shrugged. She left right after you went in to see Thomas. Mrs. Chambers, Officer Miller said, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your daughter-in-law. 3 weeks later, I sat in James Hoffman's office once again, watching as he sorted through paperwork. Everything's in order, he said, pushing a document toward me. The amendments to your will removing the divorce clause are ready for your signature. I signed where indicated, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Thank you, James. May, I ask why you're removing it. Now that Thomas has filed for divorce, the clause would have benefited him greatly. I smiled slightly. It served its purpose. It forced Sarah to show her true colors. Now Thomas needs to rebuild his life without the temptation of an inheritance influencing his decisions. James nodded thoughtfully. And the foundation? That stays as is. Harold would have wanted it that way. As I left the office, the spring sunshine felt warmer, brighter somehow. Thomas was recovering at my house now, occupying his old bedroom, while he healed both physically and emotionally. Sarah had disappeared after the hospital confrontation, only to be arrested 2 days later trying to leave the country. The financial fraud investigation was ongoing, but the evidence against her was substantial. My phone rang as I reached my car. Thomas. "How did it go?" he asked. "All done," I replied. "How are you feeling?" "Better." Diane brought over some soup. "And the physical therapist says I can start walking without the cane next week. That's wonderful news." A pause then. "Mom, I've been thinking, after everything's settled, maybe I could help with the foundation, learn how to manage it." My heart swelled. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Your father would have loved that." "I found his old fishing tackle in the garage," Thomas said, his voice lighter than I'd heard in years. "Thought maybe when I'm fully recovered we could go to the lake like we used to. The three of us." "The three of us?" "You, me, and Diane." She mentioned she used to fish with her late husband. I smiled, imagining the three of us by the lake Harold had loved so much. I'd like that very much. That evening, Diane and I sat on my porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "You know," Diane said, sipping her iced tea, "Harold would be proud of you, of how you handled everything." I nodded, feeling his presence in the gentle creak of the swing he'd built. I think he knew it would come to this someday. That's why he suggested the journal. "Smart man, your Harold." "Yes," I agreed. He always saw people clearly. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of Thomas. Moving about inside the house, my son returned to me at last. "What now?" Diane finally asked. I considered the question, thinking about all that had happened, all that had changed. Sarah's manipulation had nearly cost me my son, my peace, perhaps even my life if her whispered funeral wish had been granted. But in the end, truth had prevailed. Love had prevailed. "Now," I said softly, "we live. We rebuild. We remember what matters." Inside, Thomas called out that dinner was ready. He'd insisted on cooking tonight, his first attempt since the accident. Diane and I exchanged a glance, both knowing that whatever culinary disaster awaited us, we would praise it enthusiastically. As we headed inside, I paused to look back at the porch swing, seeing Harold there for just a moment, not as he was. At the end, weakened by illness, but as he had been in his prime, strong and kind and wise. "You were right," I whispered to his memory. "I did need to protect myself, but you protected me too, even after you were gone." The breeze stirred the eye. Wind chimes he'd hung years ago, their gentle melody like laughter on the wind. And in that moment, I knew who had truly had the last laugh. It wasn't Sarah, whose greed and manipulation had left her facing criminal charges. It wasn't even me, though I had reclaimed my son and my peace. It was Harold, my sweet, quiet Harold, who had seen the truth all along and made sure I had the tools to fight back when the time came. I smiled and went inside to join my family, smaller than before perhaps, but infinitely more genuine. As I closed the door behind me, I felt Harold's presence one last time, a gentle whisper in my heart. "Well done, my love. Well done."